The Malaysian English Language Teaching Association, or MELTA as it is commonly known, is Malaysia's oldest national English language teaching association. Founded in 1958, the association has grown significantly over the years. Despite its evolution from the Selangor English Language Teaching Association, as it was first known, the aspirations of the association remain anchored to what is spelled out in our Constitution. We are an association of English language teachers dedicated to advancing English language education. Towards this end, MELTA works with partners in Malaysia as well as overseas. To date, MELTA has formal partnerships with English language teaching associations in Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Thailand, Mongolia, Indonesia, India, Brunei, Hong Kong, Bangladesh, and Taiwan. These partnerships allow MELTA to engage in continuous dialogue with other English language teaching associations, and in doing so, create opportunities for the professional development of our members on a global scale. Within Malaysia, MELTA is committed to reaching as many English teachers as possible. Towards this goal, we are represented by MELTA chapters made up of dedicated teams of English language practitioners. As a national association, the association activities are managed by several bureaus, namely Bureaus for Training, Research and Development, Publications, Special Projects, Journals, Special Interest Groups, Chapters, and Technologies. The association is only as strong as its members, so we look forward to your support. Join us and let's work towards our shared vision of advancing English language education.
Smile.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first plenary session for the conference. We're very excited to have with us Dr. Joshua Jodoin as our plenary speaker here today, who will be speaking to us on language education for sustainable development. Ladies and gentlemen, just a reminder that we will be having a short Q&A session at the end. So I invite you to post questions in the chat box for Dr. Joshua to address at the end. Before I invite Dr. Joshua to speak, let me first take a few moments to introduce him. Dr. Joshua Jodoin has a PhD in Global Environmental Studies from Kyoto University and over 14 years of teaching experience at universities in Turkey, China, and Japan. By offering practical advice and examples, he will share with us how language education for sustainable development can create global citizens who possess the language ability to negotiate, explain, and share their ideas and solutions in meaningful ways. So now it is with great pleasure that I invite Dr. Joshua to share with us his insights on language education for sustainable development.
Wonderful. Can everybody hear me? Okay. Excellent.
Yes,
okay, fantastic. Let me just get my PowerPoint going. Just one moment. All right. Thank you very, very much, everyone. Welcome to my little tiny apartment. It is very, very tiny here in Kobe, Japan, where I'm coming to you live today. I'm very, very excited to be here. Thank you, Joanna, for the introduction. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much to Melta for the invitation, to Warid and the tech team for putting this all together, and of course to Professor Ramesh Nair for the invitation early on. So as Joanna mentioned, my name is Joshua Jodoin. Feel free to call me just Dr. J. I've got a lot of J's in my name. And today I'm going to be telling you a little bit about a new field of study that I'm developing called Language Education for Sustainable Development, or LESD. And today I'm hoping to take you on a bit of a journey on some of my experiences in the world and how I've come to develop this new field. And then hopefully you guys will be introduced to something that you can use that's very practical in your language classrooms tomorrow. And hopefully you can come on this journey with me. Part of the presentation today will be an invitation. Because this is a new field, I'm really hoping to get teachers like you on board and starting to develop ideas, processes, doing research, and developing the field alongside myself. If you had the pleasure of seeing Dr. Jason Goulard's opening presentation this morning, he laid out some of the sort of foundations of what I'm going to be talking about today and some of the philosophies that are underlying it, which is great. That's a really wonderful setup. Today, I'm going to try to concentrate more on the practical sides. So I want to start by talking a little bit about an analogy of puzzle pieces. I'm currently writing a book about language education for sustainable development, or LESD, and I've been thinking a lot about puzzles lately and using this analogy quite a lot. Puzzle pieces are something that if you've done that when you were a child, as I have, you have one individual piece and you cannot see the entire picture. What we do in the classroom as language educators is we are giving our students pieces every single lesson, every single course that they take. And those pieces fit together hopefully nicely, but oftentimes students can't see the entire picture. One of the things that we do really well in language education is we give students enough pieces to really gain that language proficiency at the end, but the content is something that I want to focus on today using the Sustainable Development Goals, and I don't think we're doing a good enough job. And I'm really hoping that I can convince some of you today to buy into this idea that we need to really focus more on important, meaningful content. So today I'm going to tell you a little bit about my journey and how I started putting together some of these puzzle pieces. So to start off, I am a Canadian. I grew up in a place called Calgary, Alberta, Canada, which you can see on the map. That's that big red arrow down at the bottom. Now, Canada is an enormously huge country. Just to give you a bit of a perspective, I live in Japan now. You could fit 3 Japans in just the one province that you see on your screen, Alberta. And Japan has probably about 4 times the population of all of Canada. So Canada, huge country, small population. And I had a chance when I was younger to see some other parts of Canada. Now, I want to frame this in the sense that I had never seen the ocean before the age of 14. So I rarely traveled outside of Calgary, and my view of the world was very, very limited. I did know that Canada, and particularly Alberta, where I live, was fairly rich province in Canada because of oil and gas. And that is that orange thing that I want to point out at the top, that orange circle. That is where the Canadian oil sands reside. And when I was about 21, I had a chance to work in an Aboriginal community just north of the oil sands, some of the major developments, and basically do sort of a sports and recreation program within that. But I wasn't Aboriginal, so I lived in the oil sands company, and I basically traveled through the oil sands every day, back and forth. Now, to give you a bit of an idea, this is an image of me when I was a very, very young man. That's almost 20 years ago now. And this is the kind of machinery that is used to dig up this oil and gas from the ground. It is an absolutely enormous, enormous, enormous activity. Now, as an Albertan, I was quite proud of oil and gas when I was younger because we were a fairly rich province. And in fact, when I was about 18, I remember getting a check in the mail for about $200, which was amazing, right? And this was from oil and gas revenue. So I thought, this is the best thing ever. But I started seeing the actual effects of the oil and gas itself. Now, as you can see here in the image, you're seeing some of the pollution that's coming off those smokestacks. You're seeing the enormous machinery that's used to dig up this oil sands. Now, what we call it oil sands, because it's very different from something like Saudi Arabia, where you dig a hole in the ground and out comes oil, and you refine it a little bit, and then you have oil that you can use for plastics or in your vehicle, those types of things. Oil sands is like mixed up in all sorts of dirt and mixture of earth and soil. And it takes a huge chemical process to get rid of it. So there's things like oil sands, oil sands tailings, which are a mixture of salts, suspended soils, chemical compounds like acids, benzenes, hydrocarbons, residual bitumen, all sorts of nasty stuff. And it's collected in these sort of big ponds. They call them a pond, but they're actually more like big lakes. They're absolutely enormous, and they're growing bigger and bigger and bigger. And oftentimes they don't know what to do with them. So for me, I got to drive through this air pollution every day, see these tailing ponds on both sides, and it was very eye-opening for me. This is why we were rich, but is it worth it, right? What we're doing to the environment. Now, the other end of that is I worked in an Aboriginal community, and this is me again. As you can see, I'm up there on the right in the blue shirt. And these are some of the people that I used to work with. This was actually at a Canada Day celebration. Some of the Aboriginal, some of my colleagues, my Aboriginal colleagues, and some of the students that I worked with are in this image. And one of the things that I got to see firsthand was how it affected this small community that lived outside of the oil sands. On the one hand, many people in the community had the opportunity to work in the oil sands and made a lot of money and had good jobs. So that's kind of an economic positive. But on the other side, it disrupted their ways of life. And this community in particular had traditions of hunting and gathering, and they couldn't do that because if you went almost in any direction, you would hit an oil sand development, right, or an industrial process. And so that limited the wildlife that was there. There's also some issues with some of the tailings leaking into rivers and lakes, corrupting clean water. So the social impact was really something that was visceral to me. And going back to that analogy earlier about the puzzle pieces, I started really having to think hard about who I was as an Albertan, right, as a Calgarian, as a Canadian, and what I was seeing with these types of things, this huge environmental cost and impact. Now, many years later, I had a chance to work in China, and I worked at a university called Nottingham, or the University of Nottingham, Ningbo, China. Now, all of you in Malaysia might know that Nottingham University has a campus just outside of Kuala Lumpur. So they have 3 campuses around the world. I got to work in the China campus, and it was a really incredible experience. Now, the picture you're seeing is where I live. This is a brand new city. And just to put it in perspective, this city did not exist 4 or 5 years before I arrived. So this was the early 2010s when I started working there. And I lived in that golden building that you see on the left-hand side of your screen, up on the 38th floor. And I watched this new city develop at a breakneck pace all around me, right? So this is part of China's economic push, and it's a huge thing. Now you'll notice that's a bit foggy. That's not fog, that is air pollution. So again, we are starting to see air pollution, huge economic growth, which has many positive sides, but also many negative sides on the environment, on the economy, on the social atmosphere of the people. Now, again, this is a picture from my apartment window. On the right, you will see The development around, so again, that used to be rice paddies before I was in China. And now it is this skyscrapers everywhere around you. And the left side was this huge, huge, huge New York style building that lit up in fluorescent lights. Now, one of the things about that building, it was a beautiful, beautiful thing to see every night from our window. But oftentimes in the morning, we could not see it because the air pollution was so bad. And in fact, those of you, you might know a little bit more about this in Malaysia, but air pollution is very detrimental to people's health. So here's another image from around that community, and you can see the haze in there. This, if you look at a PM scale, so this is particulate matter 2.5 scale, the air pollution in this particular picture was over 100. And that is basically dangerous, bad for your health. Don't go outside without a mask, without a special mask to block out PM 2.5. This kind of an image was usually 4 or 5 days out of my week. So I was required to wear a mask because it was over 100, 4 or 5 days of the week. So China, growing like mad, being the world's production facility, it has some real dire consequences. And these are things that I got to see firsthand. First in Alberta, a long time ago. I traveled and lived in Turkey, which is another part of this puzzle that I don't have time to talk about today, and then China. Now, the last part, and this is something that I think a lot of you can maybe understand, is during my PhD at Kyoto University, which I finished only about 3 or 4 years ago, I really started taking a deep dive into language textbooks. And I'm sure many of you, if you're like me, I've been teaching for a long time. I've got stacks of these books at home, speaking books and reading books and writing books and TOEIC books. Now, one of the things that I was always curious about is I'm very, very interested in these environmental issues. This has become a big part of who I am as a teacher. And I would get excited when a textbook would have a topic around the environment, like climate change, for example. But it was a one-off. It was one chapter in this entire textbook. And then it basically went, there was chapter 1, which is about like going to the airport, and chapter 2, climate change, which is great. I was excited about that. Chapter 3 was something completely unrelated, like, food from different cultures. Now, for me, this disconnect was quite jarring and a little bit worrisome. And so I started doing a lot of research around it. There is a handout, which I will talk a little bit more about at the end of the presentation today. You can find some of my work around this, but basically, language textbooks do not do a good job with content. They prioritize the language proficiency side of things, which they do very, very well. But the content side is really, really poorly done in a lot of ways. And they don't make those sort of connections that are necessary for students to actually really learn and change the way that they live in the world. So this was a big, big final part of the puzzle. So after putting together all these pieces, I developed Language Education for Sustainable Development, or LESD. Now, what is LESD? So LESD, I spent a lot of time thinking and learning. I've been a language teacher for 14, 15 years at the university level, and even more of that teaching other kinds of language teaching. So EFL, ESL, EAP, CLIL. I've had a background in this for a long time. We do this very, very well, but the content side, something was wrong to me. In my PhD and along the way, I've started learning about education for sustainable development, or ESD, which it is very, very well known, and some of these other ones like environmental literacy, sustainable development, environmental education. And I really felt like these two systems had a lot to talk to each other about. In fact, there's quite a lot of overlap. And this is where LESD came around. So what is LESD? LESD essentially has 2 main goals. Now, the first goal is providing our students ways to communicate their ideas broadly. We do this already. we teach reading, listening, speaking. We teach the skills, we teach the grammar, right? We give students skills to communicate. One of the things that we don't do very well, though, is providing students opportunities to communicate broadly. And when I say broadly, I mean to other students, to other people within the university, and even expanding that out, other people within your country, other people within the world, right? And this is a big part of what LESD has developed into. So language education, I borrowed heavily from that. It does a very, very good job of the language proficiency end. And then here is the other side. We need to facilitate an understanding of the complexity and interrelatedness of challenging global issues. Now, global issues like air pollution, for example, energy, which is a big part of like the oil sands, right? Where our oil comes from. And that, as many of you know, has been sort of in the news a lot lately because of the war in Ukraine, for instance, right? So energy, these types of challenging global issues, students need to understand how they're connected, right? And how to communicate ideas about these types of things from their own cultures, and then going abroad, learning from other cultures and bringing these things back. Now, this process, once I started getting into the literature, is very complicated. So let me talk you through a little bit about how this kind of works. And let's use the example of food waste. So food waste is a common topic in sort of environmental sustainability subject matter. I've seen lots of textbooks use food waste as a great topic, right, to get students talking and engaged and excited. Now, one of the things I started looking into, I used to believe naively that I could teach students one class, right, out of the semester about food waste, and they would go away and they would never waste food again, and they would tell their parents, and their parents would stop wasting food, and I could change the world. And what I learned from looking into the literature is that's not how our brains work. When we want people to actually change their behaviors eventually, the process is very, 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 very detailed, difficult, and we have to really challenge students on their ideas about the world. So today I'm going to talk very briefly about one model of how behavior works in our brains. And this is called the values, beliefs, norms model. This is one that I learned about from Brofman, Cisternas, Lopez, Vequez. Anyways, you'll see the source down at the bottom. I'm not going to make a mess of everybody's names. And it will also be available on the handout. So I'm going to take you through this process just very quickly. This is just a general overview. And obviously this deals with psychology and it deals with many other ways. We still don't know what's happening in the brain. And if you're a language educator, it's the same way. We don't know how people really learn grammar, but we know good ways of getting that grammar sort of embedded. So it's the same idea. So at the end of the day, we want students to not waste food. Well, first, our students come to the classroom with what we call a new ecological paradigm. So this is an idea of, when we talk about biospheric, this is the way that they think about the environment around them, right? Egoistic, how they think of themselves in that environment. And then altruistic, what they want to do to change the world. Now, our students, the first day of class, they have this NEP, right? And the idea is if we want to take them on a journey where we don't want them to waste food, we have to do many, many steps. And you can think about this as like actual steps going up, right? It's like a hierarchy. You have to hit the bottom step first, and then you can do the next step. So the first part of it is what we call an awareness of consequences. We need to give students the ability to understand the consequences of food waste, right? So for example, food waste, if a bakery throws out a whole bunch of bread, well, this has impacts because those resources, right, the wheat and the barley and the things that were used to make that bread or that rice, for example, all of that is wasted. All of that energy, right, that comes from somewhere is wasted down the line. We can also bring in ideas of homelessness, for example, right? Why can't we be using food waste to feed other people, especially if that's still good nutritious food. And it also brings us into ideas of policy, right? Where the governments, local governments, national governments are concerned, right? How do those policies affect what a bakery has to do with their bread at the end of the day, right? So we have to challenge our students, bring them through this journey of it. The next step, so we've done that. Now we have to try to figure out who's responsible for this food waste. Is it the consumer that's responsible? Or is it maybe the restaurant that offers too much food, right? Or is it, who is responsible, right? We have to be able to challenge our students, get them talking about it. Now, I'm sure many of you, like me, are language educators, and you're thinking critical thinking is part of this process. That is a major, major element of it, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. The last step is personal norming. And when we talk about personal norming, what we mean is we want students to start being able to say they want to do something about whatever pro-environmental behavior, whatever behavior we want. So wasting less food, for example. So they have to be able to write it out. I want to waste less food, right? Here's how I'm going to do it. Or say it, right, in a speaking class. I want to waste less food because, or I go to this restaurant because they allow me to choose the portions that I get, right? So I waste less food. These types of personal norms are the last step. Now, believe it or not, people can express that they want to do something like not waste food and waste food all the time. So it doesn't translate directly to actions. Finally, if you've gone through all of these steps, all of these hierarchies, right? Eventually, at some future time, students will change their behaviors. They will start wasting less food, for example, or making better choices around the environment, or choosing to use less plastic. But this journey is something that takes a long time. It's a long, involved process, and we can't expect to do this in just one class. We can't even expect to do it in one course. We have to, this has to be something that together we develop ways of doing this, and the students encounter and rub up against all of these types of things, challenge their values, beliefs, and norms about the world, and eventually we'll get students to that point. So we have our lovely students here, and through LESD, we need to challenge those values, beliefs, and norms. And then we also want to create proficient language users. So at the end of the day, those are the basic two goals of LESD. And these two things need to come together, right, to be one. Now, I won't go into too much theory here, but essentially, I envision language education not just doing the language educating, right, but to share that with important content. And the important content is stuff that is brought up by the Sustainable Development Goals. Through Education for Sustainable Development, which is sort of the philosophical underpinnings and the educational ideas that show us how to get this. And then at some future time, students are going to change their behaviors. So we can see ESD is what takes them through that journey in the middle of that VBN model. Now, the Sustainable Development Goals are this blueprint to achieve a better and more sustainable future for all. They address global challenges we face, including poverty, inequality, climate change, environmental degradation, peace and justice, good jobs. There's so much to it. And one of the important things to think about is that these Sustainable Development Goals are interconnected. They're fundamentally, so for example, you can't just understand something in isolation. Climate change, right? When you have situations that are countries that are affected by climate change, this affects the food that people have access to, especially things like flooding right now in Bangladesh, right? It also affects gender inequality and equality. These are things that we don't often think about coming together, but there is more and more evidence that these things are interconnected. And so that's the challenge. How do we integrate these very, very fundamentally important ideas that have been brought up by the United Nations, right? Use these in our classrooms to engage our students, give them meaningful, important content. So what I've done is I've developed something I call the SCOPE framework, and I'm going to go through that very quickly right now and talk a little bit about how this SCOPE framework works and how you can use it in your classroom. So the first one of SCOPE, so S-C-O-P-E, is student-centeredness. Now, language educators will understand student-centeredness very, very well. This is something that comes up a lot in the environmental education literature as well. And so it is something that we just need to talk the same language around. Critical thinking, or what is known in, I guess, environmental education realms as challenging VBNs, values, beliefs, and norms of our students around the world. These two things can be thought of as sort of interchangeable, and we need to add real elements of that into our classroom teaching. We need to offer students opportunities for feedback, and this is self-feedback, which is very, very important. Peer feedback, having their peers around them giving feedback, and then as well, the teacher needs to be there as the facilitator to help guide students along that route. Then we want students to practice, demonstrate, show their knowledge to the world. And this can be done through PowerPoint presentations, posters. This can be done through things like creating YouTube videos, Flipgrids, whatever that might be. And the very last part, and this is very, very important, is to educate others. This is a huge, huge, huge part of sort of climate change education, for example. But once the students have some understanding about the way that the world works, we want them to go out into the world and to provide that and give it to other people. So again, student-centeredness. Here's a couple of examples from my classroom where this is a class that I taught where students actually got to choose their research topics. And so one student asked about food waste. They worked in a bakery in Osaka. And another student asked about meat, right? What kinds of meat are good for the environment? What kinds of meat are bad for the environment? Critical thinking, again, we have to take students on this journey. And it's not something we can do in just one singular lesson. This has to be something that is coordinated and built into a course, a curriculum, built into a school's education program. We need to have lots of opportunities for feedback, like I mentioned. And this feedback system is very, very essential. We want students to practice and demonstrate knowledge. Now, again, when they are practicing and demonstrating knowledge, they have a new understanding of the world and they are presenting that out. And then if we build in feedback into it, if we build in opportunities for critical thinking, the students can go back and revise what their understandings were and create new understandings, deeper parts. Going back originally to that analogy of the puzzles, they can add more puzzle pieces to that overall picture, right? So things start becoming clearer for them. We want students to educate others. Here at my university, Konan University, we have something called Pechakucha Night, which is an opportunity for students to present their ideas. It can be about anything they want. 20 slides, 20 seconds, similar to like a TED Talk. And this is I really, really try to push students and motivate students to present what they're doing in my classroom to a broader audience, because it's a chance for them to, again, refine their understandings of the world, get feedback, and then share these new learnings and understandings. It is very, very, very powerful. So in closing, I'm going to leave you guys with this idea of scope. I've been working on a book, as I mentioned, and I've also been writing several papers. There's a couple of forthcoming papers that are coming out this fall in the next couple months, and they sort of talk more deeply about this scope. And this is something, again, that you can start implementing in your classroom tomorrow. You don't have to implement every single element of it, but try to do the best you can, right? So again, if you are a head teacher and you have an opportunity to develop that into a curriculum, right, where several teachers and classrooms can use that, please do it. Or if you're a teacher using a textbook, see if there's ways that you can implement these ideas, whether on a smaller scale in your classroom. Oops. So We want to transition from this idea of transmissive, right, giving students knowledge, to transformative teaching, where we're actually making the students at the center of it, giving them the tools to explore ideas on their own and get excited about them. And then, of course, we want to integrate these sustainable development goals. These really are hugely, hugely important and critical issues that the world faces. Jason Gula this morning, Dr. Jason Gula, he talked quite a lot about this, especially around climate change and the Anthropocene. Our students are facing immense challenges, but by doing LESD in the classroom, we are empowering our students. We're giving them knowledge to do this. We're building resilience for them when these major things occur. So let's have a look at one of our students here. This student here is facing a world that is going to be affected by climate change. And they are going to have an opportunity to try to develop some of these solutions, become resilient to it. We have a huge population in the world. We're going to be hitting 7 billion mark this year, most likely in November. And we have all of these people in the world that we need to feed and clothe and provide education for. We've had the pandemic recently, which has been an enormous challenge for teachers and students alike. And looking at ways that we can empower our students so that they're ready for this in the future. And then, of course, things like hunger, world hunger, which is oftentimes linked to things like gender inequality and good work. These are all things, again, that are brought up in the Sustainable Development Goals that our students need to deal with in their future. So, language education for sustainable development wants to empower students so that they can communicate their ideas, their cultures, their values and beliefs, right, broadly. So again, within their communities, their classrooms, their universities, their nations, and then more broadly, we want students to go and communicate those to Malaysian students, talking to Japanese students, talking to American students, talking to people in Bangladesh, right? English is a lingua franca at the moment. It might not be the best language in the entire world. I won't get into that controversy, but it's what we've got, right? And it empowers students. It gives them an opportunity. It's the languages that are used at the United Nations, for example. So we want students that can communicate. And then again, we want our students to understand the Sustainable Development Goals. So I'd like to leave you with a final thought here. And I'm going to borrow a little bit from computer science. The little dot, the green dot on the board here is like a node in a larger network, right? So think about a node like a computer access point, right? You access the internet, which is a connected network of computers from one node. We can also think about this like you in the classroom, right? You are a node in a community of teachers. And your job is to inspire your students, present them with meaningful content and language skills so that they start making connections with the world around them, right? Using meaningful content like the Sustainable Development Goals can start that process. When the students leave you, they're going to go to somebody else's classroom. And again, if they are using meaningful content, Sustainable Development Goals, and they're making connections back. So students are starting to get more puzzle pieces and they're starting to see the fuller picture, right? That community can support our students. And again, the more experiences they have in the world, right? The more they're going to make these connections and put together this larger puzzle. Sustainable Development Goals are unbelievably interconnected, right? And are essential and important. So again, you want to play the role of being a node, teaching your students about these things, and then the more of a community we build around these ideas of language education for sustainable development, the more opportunities students will have to hit these ideas, right? See them again, scaffold them, and develop this fuller picture of the world so that they can be active players in the world in the future, find those solutions to some of these major, major issues. So going back to this analogy at the beginning that I talked about, right? The Sustainable Development Goals are interconnected, and language education for sustainable development is trying to build a roadmap of how to sort of do this well in the classroom. Now, a couple of quick things I want to mention. The first one is that this isn't easy, right? So again, we do language education. That alone, so improving our students' language proficiency, is challenging and difficult. But adding that layer, the meaningful content using sustainable development goals, right, and trying to build that into our lessons, our courses, our curriculum, our universities, our education schools, right? This is going to have an enormous impact, right? So our students can not only understand these important ideas, but communicate them, right, in the lingua franca, learn about other cultures. And this is a powerful and important idea. So I'd like to put out a call to all of you today to join me on this journey, right? You have agency to a certain extent in your language classrooms, and you can be part of this. So Scope is one tool that you can start using and thinking about. And like I mentioned, I'm trying to develop more tools, but you can be a part of that. You can be a part of the research, you can be a part of developing this new field that I call LESD alongside me. So with that, big thank you very, very much for listening. And there is a handout, and I'm going to talk about that just very, very briefly here. And I think the organizers are going to share that with you in the chat room. But there is several different references on that, again, if you can't get it for some reason because it's locked behind a paywall, get in touch with me. There's also a feedback form, and you can simply just use your phone, scan that QR code, and it will take you to a very, very short Google form. It's going to take you less than 4 or 5 minutes. And basically that gives me some feedback. There's also an opportunity to be added to a email list if you want to learn more about the work that I'm doing in the future. Please get in touch. So with that, a huge, huge, huge thank you very, very much to everyone. And I am very, very excited to learn about your questions and stuff. I think we still have about 10 minutes left.
Thank you so much, Dr. Joshua, for sharing from your experiences, and also I think really reinforcing the importance of bringing critical issues, global issues into the English language classroom. We have some time for questions. So there's one here for you, and I think you can see it on the screen, but I'll read it out as well. Dr. J, do you think that PBL activities, project-based learning activities, would be more effective in imparting values and shaping beliefs because project requires students to explore a topic in depth?
So thank you very, very, very much for that question. So PBL is project-based learning. This is something that actually I do at my university. So I teach, for example, a course which is Model United Nations, and we actually get our students to go to a conference, right? I'm teaching an environmental ethics class coming up. And again, the students have to go out into the community, interview people at local businesses, and bring that knowledge back. So this sort of place-based learning, PBL, or project-based learning, is very, very, very useful. One of the things that I'm writing about right now in my book and thinking a lot about is not everyone, not all language educators have that opportunity to do this sort of project-based learning in their classroom. Maybe they're using a textbook, maybe they're using set curriculum. And so a lot of that isn't. If you have the opportunity though, definitely. If you give the students an opportunity to, like we talked about before in Scope, student-centered, so they choose their topics, the things that they want to research themselves, and then they're able to bring that knowledge back, share it amongst bigger groups of people, get feedback, right? So this is that idea of the Scope framework. So PBL works extremely well alongside that Scope framework. And if you have the opportunity as a teacher and you're lucky enough to be able to adjust those things in your classroom, please do it. do it as much as you possibly can, because that is very, very powerful, using that meaningful content from the Sustainable Development Goals. So thank you very much for the question. That's wonderful.
Okay, we have another question. How would you recommend teachers to start practicing these ideas with elementary level pupils?
Excellent. So these are younger, right, kids. One of the things that I would strongly suggest is looking at the literature around environmental education, or EE. There's a huge amount of literature out there, and environmental education is usually focused on younger elementary school kids. When it comes to language, obviously the language is going to be a little bit more difficult with the lower levels, depending on the level that they're working at. But the environmental education part of it, a lot of that is actually bringing students place-based learning types of activities, where they're going out into a local forest or a local park. They're exploring nature. They're learning about the environment, right? And then introducing sort of some of these important concepts like climate change very lightly, but showing the students how that is affecting the world, right? Yeah, so again, my focus has always been in the university level, but I am very, very familiar with environmental education, and there's a lot of really wonderful stuff out there about how to sort of integrate some of these ideas, especially with younger learners. So please check it out, environmental education, or ESD, Education for Sustainable Development, for younger learners.
Okay, I think we can wrap up today's plenary session. So thank you very much again, Dr. Joshua, for being here with us and for providing us with so many valuable insights. To the participant, yes?
Sorry, Joanna, do I have time just to quickly share the handout? Just to very, very, very quickly?
Sure. Yeah, sure we do.
Sure. Okay, there is the handout. If you can, please get the handout. You'll notice there's a whole bunch of useful links and references there. And then down at the bottom, there is some really, really useful links. There's a QR code, which is that form. So this should get you started if you have some ideas or you want to start integrating these things, regardless of the level, from elementary all the way up to the university level. So thank you very much. Sorry to interrupt, Joanna.
It's okay. No worries. Okay, to ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank you once again for being present here in this plenary session with us. I'd also like to invite you to go back to our main conference page, because we have a forum coming up soon at 12 noon. So please don't forget to click on the forum link. Thank you once again for being here with us, and we wish you a fruitful conference ahead.
Thanks, everybody.